Another World came out on the Apple II and MS-DOS back in the late 80s, and was one of those games that blew everyone away that played it. But I never had a computer back then, and the only time I was ever able to see it was watching the original PC version played on a pre-recorded video at a local Babbage's. But even then, I was amazed at what I was seeing. That was the first time I ever saw a game telling its story through animated cutscenes. It also looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. But I just accepted that I'd never get to play it, since PCs costed at least $800 billion back then. At least that's what my 8-year-old self figured. So I was pretty shocked years later when I see Another World show up at my local video store for the good old Super NES, now named Out of This World for some reason. Honestly, I wasn't sure what I was going to get, since a Super NES was no match for a PC in terms of power, and Out of This World definitely looked like it needed some power to run it. But I was at least hoping that a little bit of what I saw on that Babbage's video screen would come through on the Super NES, and thankfully, I wasn't too disappointed. Firing up Out of This World brings up the introduction. The opening sorta tells you what's going on, but it all basically boils down to you being a scientist named Lester that was in the middle of doing some super dangerous sciencey type stuff. Of course, things go horribly wrong and Lester finds himself teleported to an alien world where everything wants to kill him the second he gets there. Sorta like the science fiction version of Australia. After a quick introduction to murderous wildlife, Lester's taken captive by a few not-so-friendly aliens. From there, it's all about you working with a fellow prisoner to escape the alien prison camp. It's a cool story, and one that's told with no text at all. Everything's conveyed through the cinematics or by character animation. And while most of it's obscured by design, it always makes you feel like you're really in another world. I've always enjoyed this type of minimalistic approach to storytelling, and Out of This World is a great example of how to do it well, and it's honestly one of my favorite things about the game. But story aside, the first thing you'll really notice about Out of This World is its graphics. It was a really neat game to look at back in the day, and even on the less powerful Super NES, the artwork and animation come through with barely anything lost from the PC release, besides everything being a lower resolution. Even the animated cutscenes made it through, which almost caused me to go into a fit of excitement when that intro first came on the screen. There was really nothing else on the Super NES that looked like it, and it always stood out to anyone that saw it, especially when comparing it to the colorful, cartoony worlds that most games back then were shoving down our throats. Out of This World offered a darker, more violent world to explore. That was probably a bit of a departure from last weekend's rental of something like Mr. Nuts. Honestly, the majority of 16-bit games all kind of run together in my head now, but I really think Out of This World still stands out to this day. Once you've pulled yourself off the floor from all those neato graphics, the game puts you right into its world without any warning. Controlling things may initially look simple thanks to its 2-button layout, but it's actually more complex than first impressions let on. At first, all it seems Lester can do is either run, kick, or jump his way around the levels, but you'll soon find a gun that not only fries enemies to a crisp, but can also put up a laser shield that protects you. This is when things start getting a little more hectic, as you'll be running to get into position, putting up a shield, then ducking to fire off a few shots before you have to put up another shield. And all of this is done with just 2 buttons, which you'd think would make things super simple, but it's really not. There's just too many things going on that you need to do at once, and it feels really cramped to have to rely on 2 buttons to do it all with. Stick with it though, and eventually you'll be fending off multiple alien waves without too much of a problem. And while all of that may make Out of This World sound like an action game, it's not. It's actually more of an adventure game at heart. Sure, you get to shoot and kill aliens throughout the game, but you're going to have to deal with puzzle solving more than balls to the wall action. Some of the puzzles in the game are your standard figure out this obscure thing so you can progress type puzzle. But the majority of the puzzles will probably kill you before you even realize it's a puzzle. Most of the time you'll walk into a new screen and die immediately and have no clue what to do. So it's up to you to find your way through. It's pretty fun to figure these puzzles out, but the side effect is that you'll be dying a lot in Out of This World, and when I say a lot, I mean a lot. Falling onto spikes, getting mauled by alien gorillas, drowning, and even getting killed by lowly worms will come quick and often. It can be discouraging, especially thanks to the cutscenes that show your horrific death in detail. But you have to realize that dying is just part of the game, so get used to it. The biggest problem with the constant dying is that the checkpoint system kinda sucks, sometimes making you redo several steps before you finally get back to what's killing you. It can be frustrating, but at least it's always super satisfying to finally get past a part that's killed you well over a dozen times. But even with tons of puzzles and obstacles in his way, the biggest thing that Lester, and by extension you, will have to overcome are the controls. I already mentioned that the 2-button layout isn't the most elegant, but that's really only the start. The game's smooth animation may look good in motion, but it makes for sluggish controls. And until you can get the hang on how it works, you'll probably be throwing the controller as Lester misses yet another jump, or doesn't do what you tell him to do. The game's by no means unplayable, but it's just something you have to have patience with to learn. And even once you do, you'll still probably find Lester occasionally not responding when you need him to the most. It's by far the game's biggest problem. Another problem with the game is just how poorly it can run. Sure, the graphics and animation made it over mostly unscathed from the PC release, but the performance sure didn't. For the most part, the game runs fine, if a little framey. Other times though, the game comes to a literal crawl as there's just too much going on for the poor Super NES to handle. The worst offender is probably this scene where the cave rocks are falling down on top of you. I mean, seriously, look at this. It's running at like 3 frames per second. And this isn't some scene where you're just running through it. You have to actually use precise timing here to avoid the rocks. It's not easy even when the game's running perfect on the PC, but it's almost impossible to do with a frame rate this low on the Super NES. And while that's probably a worst case scenario, the low frame rate's still noticeable throughout the entire game, and that makes for a really inconsistent experience controlling Lester, as if it wasn't hard enough already. And of course, we can't get through a review of Out of This World without mentioning the game's length. To be blunt, it's way too short. While it may take you a while to figure out the game's puzzles, you probably won't need more than a few hours to do so. And once you figure them out, you can probably play through the entire game in just under half an hour. Yep, you heard that right, just under half an hour. The game's brutal and sometimes cheap difficulty goes a long way in making you replay those scenes over and over in hopes of making the game longer, but it doesn't take much more than a bit of trial and error to get past any scene in the game. And once you figure it out, you'll be running through the game like it's nothing. It's still fun to play through, but a 25-minute long game is still a pretty big downer for anyone that paid full retail price for Out of This World back in the day. But even if it's short, hard to control, and full of cheap deaths, Out of This World is still one of my favorite adventure games. The minimalistic storytelling and visuals go a long way in still making me genuinely excited to play the game. And while it's hard to recommend the Super NES version to someone, the remastered version that's on modern consoles and phones is still worth looking at, as long as you can accept that it was a product of its time. And if you can manage that, along with having a saint's amount of patience, then I think you'll understand why Out of This World really is Out of This World. Tiny Toons was a pretty big deal back in the early 90s. It seemed like it was on TV just about any chance a station could show a block of cartoons. I was never that into it myself, since I was never a big Looney Tunes fan in the first place, but I can't deny that I was definitely in the minority on that one. A lot of kids really loved Tiny Toons, and of course anything that popular with kids back then was gonna get its fair share of video games made. Tiny Toons did just that with games spanning from the PlayStation 2 all the way down to those god-awful Tiger Electronic handheld games. I personally only ever played the Super NES game called Buster Bust Loose, so let's see if it does the show any justice at all. As soon as you turn the game on, you're treated with a nice Mode 7 Tiny Toons logo and a great rendition of the theme song. After that, you get a threadbare story as Babs and Buster sets up each stage before you start with some pretty cringeworthy dialogue sequences. Once you skip those out of sheer embarrassment, you get tossed right into the game, so I hope you read the instructions before you started. Buster Bust Loose is basically your standard platform game with a few twists here and there. Buster runs and jumps around easily enough, but you can't just hop on top of enemies and kill him. Instead, there's a separate button for a jump and kick attack that just sorta looks and acts like a jump. It's actually kinda awkward to use since Buster jumps into the air before he kicks, which can result in you going over the top of enemies' heads sometimes. Overall, it seems needless and probably would have just been better off letting you jump on enemies' heads like every other platform game in existence. Buster can also use a limited dash that allows him to run up walls and jump extra far. It's really fun to do for the most part, and a lot of the stages are built around using it to navigate large obstacles or find hidden areas. You can only use it as long as your dash meter lasts though, so don't get stuck in the middle of a long jump with no dash power left, or you'll be falling to your doom fairly regularly. The worst thing about the dash is that it can sometimes be a bit unwieldy. Press the wrong direction during a dash and you'll suddenly have Buster dashing all over the place until you can get him back under control again. For the most part, it's not a big problem, but it usually happens at the worst times, sending Buster off into a group of enemies or right off the side of a ledge. Still though, it's fun to use and definitely more fun than that stupid kick attack. After you get the controls down, it's time to settle in for a standard trek through 16-bit platform Game Town. The stages are all pretty generic, including such timeless classics as a Wild West stage, a space stage, and of course the haunted house stage with spooky ghosts and vampires in tow. If you're looking for innovation here, you best look elsewhere. This is a Tiny Toons game after all. There is one stage that stands out though, that being the football stage where you're playing the last drive of the game and down by one score. You can either run or pass the ball to get down the field, and it's actually really fun and kinda out of nowhere compared to the rest of the game. But even if the rest of the stages are nothing too special, they're at least all pretty fun to play and offer up a good deal of gameplay variety. Besides your standard platforming, you'll occasionally have to do stuff like find keys to open locked doors, or hide behind stuff to avoid massive laser blasts. You get a few bosses here and there as well, but none really offer up that much of a challenge. But the game at least seems to have fun with what it was given to work with, and you can definitely see that it shines through in most of the stages, even if you feel like you're playing through platform game number 487 sometimes. Stages are broken up with some fairly interesting minigames. Spin a wheel and get a randomly chosen game that helps you net a few 1-ups to use in the real game. Some are kind of fun, like helping Babs find her friends in an overhead maze, while others like Bingo are completely random and really no fun at all. I guess they're all fine for what they are, but I wish I could choose what I wanted to play instead of having it chosen for me. I'd always rather play the Babs game over something like guessing characters' weight. Seriously, who thought a guess the weight game would be fun in a video game? You probably won't have too much trouble making it through Buster's 6 stages, and once you do, there's very little to keep you coming back for more. Some stages can certainly be challenging, but you'll usually have gained a good deal of 1-ups from the minigames, so you'll probably never see a game over screen unless you just turn off the Super NES in frustration. Overall though, Buster Bust Loose isn't a bad game at all. I remember having fun with it when I rented it as a kid, and it's at least got some great graphics and music throughout. So if for some reason you're looking for a fun but short Tiny Toons game on the Super NES, well, here's your game. You could probably do a lot worse than Buster Bust Loose, and I can at least say that it's way better than that Tiger handheld game. Skater Dive was one of those games I played briefly at a family member's house and instantly fell in love with it. Skateboarding was fascinating to me at the time, and a game devoted to various skateboarding events seemed really awesome. I had so much fun with it that night that I eventually saved up enough money to buy it for myself, finally able to play it for as long as I wanted. I just wish I'd known at the time that as long as I wanted would translate into about 20 minutes total. But before we get into horrible childhood regret, let's check out what Skater Dive is actually all about first. Once you're done listening to the super rad start menu music, you'll jump straight into Lester's skate shop. If you can manage to not scream in terror at Lester himself, you'll find that there's not much else to do in here. You can go practice, compete, or register your name to track your high scores. You can also move your cursor around to various stuff to see what Lester has to say about him, but it's not much since it's obvious poor Lester here spends every waking moment of his broken life fiending for his next fix. Once you've exhausted the 10 or so seconds it takes to do any of that, and trying not to look at Lester directly in the eyes, it's time to exit the skate shop and hit the streets for some extreme skateboarding action. Skater Die's main hub is nothing more than one screen with a total of 5 different skateboarding events to compete in. Just skate to the one you want to do and you're instantly teleported to that event. Pretty simple stuff. And since Skater Die is a non-linear game, I figure we can take a look at each individual event to get an idea of what you'll be doing. First up is Freestyle. Freestyle is your standard half-pipe that you do tricks on to get the highest score possible. And while it may look super simple, there's actually a surprising amount of tricks and strategy to pulling them off. You can either do lip tricks or go for big air for some of the highest scoring tricks. Timing's everything though, since you can hold tricks for as long as you want, but hold them too long and you'll fall off, giving you no points at all, and that's seriously not cool. You get a total of 10 passes to build up the highest score you can, so you really need to nail the biggest tricks consistently to make all of your friends super jealous of those high scores. This is probably the best event in the game, and definitely has that one more try mentality to get a better score. Unfortunately, it's all kinda downhill from here on out. The race event is totally false advertising, since it's not actually a race. It's just a time trial to see how fast you can make it to the bottom of the track. All you need to do is point in the direction you want to go, avoid some obstacles, and get past the finish line in one piece. It sounds simple enough, but the control in this event gives new meaning to the word sluggish. While it may in fact look like you're controlling a nimble skateboarder, the game seems to think that you're actually trying to navigate an aircraft carrier down the course instead. Seriously, just the act of simply nudging your skater slightly left or right can take upwards to 3 to 4 seconds to actually happen on screen. Eventually, you sort of get the hang of its crappiness, but honestly, it's just awful and never really fun at all. Even the course itself is fairly dull, with only a couple of chances for tricks. But tricks will be the furthest thing from your mind, since just getting your skater to turn is sadly just as exciting. Joust is kind of a weird event. Basically, it's you against one of 3 selectable opponents, trying to knock them off their boards using a giant paddling oar. You both start off on opposite sides, and the person with the paddle gets 5 passes to try and jam it upside the other person's head. If they miss on all 5 passes, the other person gets the paddle, and then it's their turn to try and do horrific bodily harm. It's a neat idea, but can't really come together due to the fact that there is no real depth perception in the pool. Unless you're right next to your opponent, you have no idea if he's at the front of the pool or the back. This leads to a ton of misses, since you just can't figure out where you need to be. This would have been much more fun and playable from a top-down perspective. As it is though, it's more confusing than fun. Jam is probably the second best event in the game, behind Freestyle. Unlike the race event, this one is an actual race, as you and your opponent navigate the world's most confusing alley to try and get to the street first. There's a ton of different obstacles scattered about, and a few different pathways and jumps you can pull off that makes it way more fun than race ever was. Also, unlike race, the control here is fairly responsive, so it's actually fun to play. Why couldn't they have just used this control for race? It's basically the same thing. Oh well, if you played Skater Die back in the day, you probably played a lot of Jam, and it's still pretty fun to this day. There's a lot of little touches here and there that still make it really charming, like getting chopped into cubes if you hit a fence, or falling down a manhole. It may not be anywhere near perfect, but I still at least enjoy playing this event more than most of the others. High jump's just what it says, and it's by far the worst event of the bunch. You get 4 practice jumps before you have to try and get the highest jump you can on your 5th pass. To do this, all you're doing is jamming left and right on the D-pad to gain speed for big air. There's a certain timing to it to get the higher jumps, but it seems really random, and even if you figure it out, it's not exactly fun or satisfying to pull off. The best thing I can say for it is that it's over quick, giving you just enough time to regret picking this event instead of one more go at Jam. Once you've played all 5 events, which in all honesty should take you no less than 5 minutes total, you'll be left wondering what exactly else there is to do in Skater Die. Unfortunately for you and your $50 that you just spent on Skater Die, that's about it. Besides the practice mode, you can enter into a competition which is exactly like practice mode, but this time the event will record your high score at the end so you and your buddies can fight over the top spot when they come over, I guess. There's also a Compete All road, which is nothing more than, yep, you guessed it, competing in all 5 events in order. Your performance seems to place you at the end of each event, but it's never clear on who you're competing with or how much better you need to do to place higher. This would have been a pretty cool mode if it were an actual competition against other named skaters, but as it is, it's nothing more than another way to play the same 5 events over and over again with no real reward for doing so. Beyond that, Skate or Die mostly hopes you enjoyed playing the events enough that you'll play them over and over again. But with only 2 events being moderately fun, you'll probably be tired of Skate or Die in less than an hour, if that. It can be fun to take turns with friends for high score chasing, but even that gets old due to just how quick each event is over. None take more than a minute or 2 to beat, and high jump doesn't even last 30 seconds. So there's not much here to really sink your teeth into for more than a few minutes at best. At the end of the day, Skate or Die was probably one of my bigger gaming regrets as a kid. If I'd known that I'd played essentially the entire game at my aunt's house, I probably wouldn't have bothered buying it. There's just not enough here to warrant a full game, not even by NES standards. It does have a few high points here and there, but there's just no excuse for how little gameplay actually exists. Unfortunately, Skate or Die just isn't worth your time, even with what little time it takes up. One of the best things about owning the original Game Boy back in the day was finally getting games that we had been playing in the arcade and on the NES for years on a small portable handheld. It would be really hard to express these days just how amazing that was back then, but let's just say it wasn't too far off from being a religious experience to any 10-year-old that got a Game Boy. I was lucky enough as a kid to get one, and one of the first games I immediately looked for was Contra, which was probably one of my favorite games on the Nintendo at the time. Thankfully, Konami, publishing under the Ultra Games label, put out Operation C for the Game Boy back in 1991, and it ended up being just about everything I could have hoped for in a portable Contra game. Operation C is shockingly close to the Contra you know and love, just on a smaller scale. It's nothing more than your standard run-and-gun game that Contra perfected on the NES. You take control of Contra veteran Bill Riser, and it's up to you to take out the alien menace that's come to Earth to wipe out humanity. To do so, all you'll need to do is run to the right and shoot every alien that appears on the screen. You'll also need to blast through 3 side-scrolling and 2 overhead levels filled with enemy aliens and their crazy weaponry to finally make it to the last boss and save Earth from its horrific fate. To help combat the waves of aliens coming at you, you'll get your standard assortment of Contra weapon upgrades like the spread shot and the fire gun. You can even upgrade the spread gun in this game to make it more overpowered than it already was. Operation C also adds the totally new homing gun weapon that makes short work of just about anything on the screen. So grab your favorite gun and start jamming on the fire button, and you should start making progress in no time. Beyond that, there's really not much else to mention gameplay-wise. This is Contra after all. You should know the drill at this point. Operation C is obviously based off the NES game Super C, and does a great job of bringing it to the small screen of the Game Boy. Though unfortunately in its trip over, the game got scaled back a bit from its bigger brother. You only get a few weapons to pick up in the Game Boy version, as opposed to double the amount in Super C. Also, the 10 or so levels of Super C has now been pushed down to a minuscule 5 on the Game Boy, making for yet another Game Boy game that can be played through in about half an hour. Though the biggest thing that gets nerfed in Operation C is the difficulty. Contra games have always been insanely hard, but Operation C bucks that trend entirely with a game you can play through with almost no real challenge. Sure, you'll die here and there, and the 3 continues might make you start over once or twice, but it never feels like the game's putting up much of a fight. There's barely ever more than a few enemies on the screen at a time, and the bullets seem to move at the pace of a lazily thrown softball. Even the bosses, which have been ballbusters since the original Contra, are all pushovers in Operation C. And the aforementioned new homing gun is really the only gun in the game you'll need, since it can take out just about everything on screen with little effort. It makes the entire game feel limp, coming off more as baby's first Contra rather than a full-blown Contra game. But even with being scaled back quite a bit, Operation C still does an amazing job of translating the Contra experience onto the Game Boy screen without too much sacrificed. And for us kids that bought it back in the day wanting nothing more than a playable Contra on the go, this was as close to perfect as we were going to get. And even with the pared back difficulty and length, I still played through it what must have been dozens of times as a kid. and I still had fun playing it for this review. Operation C may not be the most hardcore Contra game ever, but if you're looking for Contra on the go, I'd give it a strong recommendation. It's really fun while it lasts, and taking out Red Falcon and his army of goons will never get old as far as I'm concerned, no matter what size screen you play it on. Dinosaurs For Hire is a fairly obscure Genesis game released back in 1993. It was based off the late 80s comic book of the same name and seemed like a pretty neat idea. Essentially, a group of dinosaurs from space come to Earth to become mercenaries that fight off ninjas and other giant mutated dinosaurs to keep the peace. It's pretty close to being a 10-year-old's fever dream, but I can assure you that this actually existed. And much to the excitement of the 5 people that ever played it, so did the video game. So if you're at all interested in seeing what this insane mess of a game is all about, or just want to have the answer to an obscure video game trivia question someday, then stick around, because we're about to get all Jurassic on that ass. As soon as you start up the game, you're given the choice between 3 different dinos to play as. Archie the T-Rex is the de facto leader of the group, and seems to enjoy wearing the outfit from the Terminator to hammer the point home. Lorenzo the Stegosaurus is the self-proclaimed snob that collects Hawaiian t-shirts, going for that mid-30s fat guy look that's all the rage with dinosaurs, I guess. And finally, there's Reese the Stegosaurus, whose main talent seems to be that he's completely insane. While there's not much else to differentiate the characters besides their looks, they do at least have some minor differences in speed and how much damage they can take. For example, Reese can take a lot more damage than Archie, but he's a slower and larger character, so it sort of evens out. Besides that, they all start with the same gun, so just choose which dino you think looks the most ridiculous and get your prehistoric butt into the game. Once in the game, you're thrown straight into a boss battle with a giant dinosaur climbing a dam. He doesn't take much at all to bring down, and once you do, the credits roll and, well, congratulations on beating Dinosaurs For Hire. Actually, no, you didn't. You're then informed that the blast processing unit inside your Sega Genesis went a little bit overboard, and then you get tossed into the actual game for realsies this time. I always thought that this was a pretty clever thing to do, since games back then very rarely broke the third wall or made fun of stuff like blast processing. It was actually genuinely surprising and funny at the time. But now that you're actually in the real game, it becomes apparent that Dinosaurs For Hire is just your standard run-and-gun game. Sorta like Contra, but nowhere near as fun. You're immediately assaulted by ninjas, yes, ninjas, jumping all over the place at you, and you've only got a few things you can do to defend yourself. You've got your standard jump, which is awkward as hell due to your size, a tail swipe to take out enemies that get too close, and your giant machine gun that can be powered up a few times with power-ups that you find along the way, effectively turning it into a spread gun at max power. But don't get too used to it though, since if you die, you get stuck with your default pea shooter until you can power it back up again. And with the sheer amount of dying that you'll be doing in Dinosaurs For Hire, you better enjoy that extra bit of firepower while you can. Your main goal is to basically just survive the endless waves of crazy enemies being thrown at you and make it to the end of the stage to progress. Most of the stages are your standard run to the right and kill everything type stage, and these stages aren't too bad since you're mainly just focusing on shooting stuff. Though they can get a bit tiring since the game's main form of difficulty seems to be the tried and true classic design of throw as much shit as possible at the player and hope it eventually kills them. For the most part, it's not too overwhelming, but there are definitely times where there's just so much shit coming at you that you essentially become a pinball being knocked back and forth by enemy bullets with no real way to defend yourself. Still though, these are probably the best stages in the game, if that tells you anything at all. The rest of the stages are based around exploration and platforming, and they're literally the worst things ever. Not only do you still have the hordes of enemies coming at you like the other stages, but now you get to throw in horribly awkward platforming, one-hit kills that come out of nowhere, and yes, even the cardinal sin of any platform game, fall damage. Yes, you'll actually die if you fall further than 20 feet down. Even if there's a platform below you, you'll die before you make it there because you hit the maximum amount of distance that you can fall before the game says it's time for you to die. I can't even put into words what a dumb idea it is to have fall damage in your 2D action game. But even if fall damage wasn't in the game at all, these stages would still test your patience like no other with their sheer amount of cheap enemy placement and crappy platforming that you have to endure, all while having to endlessly search through their maze-like layout. At least I could say that all the stages are fairly varied in look and design, but that doesn't necessarily make them any good. like this god-awful Battletoads jet ski level that just about made me start punching my own dick in frustration. But in the end, regardless of what type of stage you're on, it all mainly boils down to you blasting through everything in your path to get to the end of the stage and fight a boss. Speaking of bosses, they're actually one of the highlights of the game. They're all huge and have some great set pieces to fight on, especially this King Kong-like scene from the game's first real boss. And it never stops disappointing from there on out either, all the way up to the last boss. They're all pretty impressive, but some definitely fall victim to being nothing more than a fight of attrition, with no real strategy beyond just laying into them and hoping that you can take the damage. Still though, for everything that's wrong with Dinosaurs For Hire, and there is a lot wrong with Dinosaurs For Hire, it at least really stood out in the boss areas. It's just a tragedy that getting to those bosses can be so damn tedious, and really just drags everything else down with it. As you might have guessed, the biggest problem with Dinosaurs For Hire is that it's just not that much fun. You can put all the hang-gliding ninjas and drill cars in your game that you want, but it's still gotta be playable. As mentioned before, the game is a run-and-gun shooter like Contra, but unlike Contra, you're not playing as a small, nimble soldier that can dodge most anything thrown at him. Here you're playing as a pretty large dinosaur sprite that's anything but nimble. You can move around well enough, but there's just so much shit flying at you from everywhere all the time that there's no way that you'll ever be able to dodge stuff effectively. You're simply too big and turn into a giant bullet sponge because of it. You can take a good deal of damage, but there's nothing you can do besides pick up health power-ups to stop your health bar from constantly draining. It's just too frustrating overall. It really keeps the game from being any fun. It really sucks too, because Dinosaurs For Hire is a really neat game on the surface. It looks great, has some cool music, and the boss fights are some of the best around. There's even a 2-player co-op mode in there as well. Plus, it's just all around so goofy and lovable that you can't help but pull for it. If only someone would have stepped in and maybe tightened up the gameplay and stages a little, we could have had ourselves an overlooked Genesis classic here. As it stands though, you're probably not going to want to hire these dinosaurs anytime soon.